Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I am here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so very much for tuning into the show this week. Hello, and how are you, E.C.?
Good. How are you doing?
Wonderful. This week, we're going to talk about the complexities of nutrition labeling, exploring its potential impacts on consumer behavior and overall diet. I am excited about this. I know you've got some reservations as to how interesting and exciting this is for folks, but I think it's actually quite interesting. So let's talk. Give me some background. Give me some context. Why are we talking about this?
Nutrition labeling.
People like to read the back. All the time in the grocery store, you see people looking at labels. I don't know what they're looking at.
Is anyone still listening? We're talking about nutrition labeling. I think, I'm sure people can guess, but they don't know that we have a rather large document for planning this with topic ideas and, recording and posting and all of that stuff. I don't know how long nutrition labeling has been on there, but I'm sure you've seen it drop down the list.
Bumped to the bottom.
And I've wanted to do it for some time, so I'm glad that we're getting around to it. And really what happened was, that was the trigger for this, is there was a new article last month that the FDA is expected to propose a change to prepackaged food. And this really came out of the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health in 2022. I'm sure people already know we've got that label on the back, right? But the idea here is now we would have this front of packaging that would display some more key nutrition information. And a lot of other countries already use this kind of front of packaging label already. The intent is, hey, we've got a lot of busy customers. Let's help them more quickly understand the health ramifications of food they're about to select. And so that was really the trigger for this. I liked the topic a lot, but I thought that this was now a little bit more relevant to kind of bring to the forefront. And I think what's interesting too is we always hear these narratives about how much, the government is trying to kill us and make us sick, specifically with these diets, and lock us into big pharma and all of this stuff. And I think what's interesting about this topic is, like a lot of the topics we talk about, that there isn't always this clear, simple answer. And the more that I work in nutrition education, with the podcast and social media and my courses, the more I realize how much of a multifaceted approach we need besides education. So I think this topic will kind of explore that a bit.
Amazing. Front of packaging, FOP. Just putting that out there in case if we want to shorten it to FOP going forward. FOP, what would these labels actually be, look like, consist of? What could we or can we expect?
Yeah, so there's kind of two themes in front of packaging labeling ideas. Wow, exciting stuff here. I promise you guys it will get a little interesting, but when you just say it out loud, it's like, wow, this is what we're talking about. But anyway, front of packaging labeling, there can be sort of this class that would be considered more summary, aka interpretive labeling. And then there's also a different type, which would be more considered nutrient-specific labeling. And before I get into the differences of what that means or looks like, I think it's useful to know that the USDA and the FDA are really interested in highlighting calories, added sugars, sodium, and saturated fat as nutrients of concern. Obviously, the overwhelming majority of people need to lower the intake of these in their diet, as we've talked about before. So that interpretive or the summary type label would make really this qualitative statement based on these factors. So there might be a table that says saturated fat high, added sugars high, or saturated fat low, added sugars low, all of that stuff. So people would generally know how the food is categorized in those different nutrients of concern. And they could also incorporate colors, let's say. So if the food is high in added sugar, there could be a red. If it's, moderate yellow, green, or low green. And you could also simplify these interpretive labels even further. So instead of having, let's say, the 4 different categories of calories, added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium, you could even maybe just use a single traffic light, where it's sort of red, don't buy this as much, green, buy lots of it. You could do something like a letter system, A through E. There's been that proposed in different countries. It could even be reduced as just a simple check mark, like the FDA puts a seal of approval, hey, check, this is a healthy food, right? So there are lots of ways that, we've got all this detailed information on the back, hey, we could bring something to summarize this on the front. And it can go from more of that table system to even just a simple check mark, as I mentioned. So lots of ranges there. Now, that's all in contrast to something that would be more of the nutrient-specific labeling system, which is exactly like it sounds. It's basically taking specific nutrient information from the back, a subset of it, and putting it on the front. So it would literally just take calories and then list, 270 and added sugar, 20 grams, et cetera, saturated fat and sodium. And to be honest, this already exists on a lot of foods because more than 10 years ago, the Consumer Brands Association started a voluntary initiative to put nutrition information on the front of packaging. And you can probably guess that food manufacturers prefer this nutrient-specific labeling because it's not a judgment call. You're not saying that these calories or added sugars are good or bad with a check mark or a traffic light. You're instead just repeating the information from the back of the label now on the front. And the government does have to be aware kind of First Amendment rights with their requirements. While the FDA has the legal authority to mandate labels and disclosures in the general interest of public health, they can't have these disclosures be, quote, controversial or unduly burdensome. And so this is one of these things where what sounds originally straightforward at the outset of like, hey, we're going to label foods healthy or not, starts to get a little bit gray. I mean, if you mandate that a manufacturer has to tell their customers essentially this is a bad product, in quotes, red light, buy less, I think you could make the point that that's unduly burdensome, right? And we have to kind of see how this plays out too. Like a birthday cake might have a red light on it, but is anybody really advocating that we all stop eating birthday cake? So we kind of have to think through all of that stuff as well and deciding which label is better.
Couple of things. One, it reminds me a little bit of the conversation we had recently about the in the episode with sugar and Alzheimer's risk and the kind of the bringing the idea of the Richter scale forward, not specifically, but like the relative risk from I think it was -6 to +6, and just give it just to create a shorthand and a common language for everybody to understand and start to learn, okay, when I see that, it means X. When I see that, it means X. I just think it's really interesting and fascinating to watch as that process unfolds a little bit. And then the second thing, which is just a silly idea, but because you're right, very few companies are going to let's put a red light, a red stop sign on our, but the first thing that popped in my head is wouldn't it be interesting if grocery stores were mandated to do that? So there are aisles not grouped as they are now, but there are red light aisles and green light aisles and yellow light aisles. So at least in where you are purchasing this most of the time, you have a sense of, okay, I'm in the red light. I really don't need a lot of these things versus obviously the perimeter, like everybody always says, there are my green lights, right? Whatever it is. Just a silly half thought.
I'm in the red light district.
I'm in the red light district of the grocery store.
It's interesting that you bring that up. I think that's going to kind of come back up, some other thoughts on implementing this. But yeah, cool. I actually like that idea more so than the individual label. Yeah.
Take it. Okay. So is it clear, back to this actual conversation, is it clear the kind of labels the FDA are going to go with? It seems like you just listed out a couple options. Could be this, could be red lights, could be numbers, could be letters. Yeah. Is there any clarity on what it looks like it may be, if anything?
I don't have, they haven't put out this is what exactly to expect. Now, they have run some focus groups. They have run experimental studies, the FDA, and they had this public meeting at the end of last year. And so they did have a presentation for that, which I was looking at. And what I understand that they're doing this year is they're putting together all of the data from their focus groups and feedback, because, anything like this has to go through these periods of public comment. So they're incorporating all of that this year, and hopefully they're coming to the conclusion this year. From the conclusions I did see at the public meeting, they are on board that front of packaging label does help consumers identify more healthy foods, and that people tend to prefer the simpler interpretive red light letter system on the front of the packaging. And what I think was in their most recent experimental study, it looks like they're leaning towards, because they go through iterations of this stuff, and so their most recent one, they're leaning towards kind of a mini table idea where it would have something like saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium, and then it would have the qualitative words like high or low or medium, and even maybe the potential colors with that. And I intuitively get the desire and the potential need for simple levels. People aren't experts. They don't have the time to totally stand in the aisle with every purchase and calculate, the saturated fat they're getting that day. People like this again, intuitively, this yes, no, good, bad idea to make it simple. I think, of course, the problem is that's what they want at first. And then with enough education, they realize those systems aren't quite as useful as they thought. There's much more nuance in nutrition. But I do also like to remind myself that, yeah, and then we have that detailed information on the back, right? So for people who want more information, there certainly is more information. It doesn't take that long to flip over a package. So as much as I see that there's some weakness in a very generic stoplight, if you will, check mark, I also don't really love the idea of just a nutrient specific repeating the information because that's already there. So it looks like they're kind of going more towards this interpretive summary, calling out specific components.
The $1 million question is, if they do that or they do something else, like, does your gut say that it will actually change purchasing and dieting behavior? And is there any research to indicate that maybe it would? Because I mean, without that, we're just playing with fun colors and fonts.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to say. And your question actually has two components where I think the data goes in different directions. And the FDA actually has a really extensive literature review they published last year. It will be in the show notes about front of packaging label, which I'm sure will be a riveting read. Maybe people can use it for better sleep. But what we do see is that the front of packaging label does help people pick more and less healthy foods when they're given a collection of foods to select from. And it does even influence purchases, as you asked. The question of whether or not that changes somebody's health, changes somebody's weight, is yet to be determined. Because I think the real issue here is I can go buy cookies that have less saturated fat. I can make that decision in the store, but that doesn't necessarily influence the rest of my diet. It doesn't tell me, like, maybe I buy the cookies with less saturated fat, but because I see that on the label, I end up eating more. Maybe it becomes justification to eat more of it. Or maybe somebody buys the lower sodium soup, but then they go on to eat a bag of chips, right? We don't have the context of what the whole intake is of the rest of the diet, that the lower sodium soup actually means nothing when we look at how much sodium they're taking in from everything else. So the labeling on the front of the packaging for any single product will never be able to answer the question that really matters from a nutritional point of view of what does the whole diet look like, and not any single product tells us what the whole diet looks like. Like, I buy products that if you thought that was representative of my whole diet, you would think I ate a terrible diet, right? And so we don't really have the data that this front of packaging label, while it helps people make better choices and even can change what they purchase, that it moves the needle in terms of our health or our weight. And what was interesting is in this kind of research to understand, do these warning labels really promote any sort of behavior change, is I started to look at cigarettes, because I think that's a good example, right? We have the cigarettes that say this could cause lung cancer. And I think it's a mixed bag of how much effect we've seen from those type of labels. One of the studies, if I think I recall correctly, that people were like more motivated in spirit to change, but whether or not that actually changed in smoking habits that decrease their risk overall, or whether or not they totally quit smoking, was a little bit more unclear. And what's interesting is, while I was looking at this, is they've actually just recently passed, I think in the last year, after a series of appeals, more graphic warning labels on the cigarette boxes, like actually showing people who have head and neck cancer, and actually showing like what a diseased lung looks like, to make these warning labels more effective, because, just a simple text box isn't doing it. And why I bring this all up is, like, it starts to make you wonder, are people just after a while with this front of packaging label not even going to see it, which I think is probably what's happened a little bit with cigarettes? Or can we really show something so graphic like they do for smoking on something like a bag of chips? I don't think we can. So it all comes into, like, is this really doing anything? Like, how much is this kind of red light, green light on the front of the packaging going to do? And I don't think we have clear indication that it will do a lot. I do like to try to present kind of the flip side of this, in the defense of adding these labels, maybe at the very least, it's that trigger. It's that sort of entryway for people to start thinking more. They see red, high, added sugars. Maybe it starts for people to start, okay, this is something that I should be thinking about. Maybe it gets them talking. Maybe it's kind of the foot in the door. I also think on a plus side from it, manufacturers will be motivated to meet the standards of whatever low sugar is or whatever low saturated fat is. So that's generally good. Again, we don't know if that'll pay off in the overall diet, but generally good. So yeah, I think it could be an initial first step for a lot of people. And I have to reality check myself sometimes that like, hey, how could I expect that a single label on the front of packaging is going to move the needle? When really, maybe it's just part of the overall system that we need to get people moving better. Like keep the information on the back, add the information on the front. Let's look at the environment. What are the education that we can do? And all of it together is what will push us towards a better outcome.
Yeah, the idea of especially with food, you're going to see these labels so often, so frequently, that maybe it's not any individual label, but it's the collective narrowing that narrows our collective focus into like, oh, okay, these are the things that seem to matter. And then maybe that is an accomplishment in and of itself.
Yeah, totally.
Interesting. If I put you in charge, what would your labeling system be? Like, what would you do if I was like, okay, EC, you're in charge. What decisions would you make? What would you ultimately put out into the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what kind of gets to what you were saying about the red light district, if you will. I kind of like the ultra processed food rating scale that we've talked about in a few podcasts, where there's these 4 food groups, and this is how they use it to, measure the effects of ultra processed food in the diet and the research studies. But group 1 is the unprocessed stuff, the fruit, the veggies, the eggs, the meat. Group 2 is the stuff that's slightly processed to extend shelf life, like herbs, fats like olive oil. Group 3 are more processed foods that are made up of just a few ingredients, like some of the breads out there or some of the jams that are literally like fruit and sugar or, wheat, wheat and whatever kind of shelf additive. But then group 4, the ultra processed foods, the ones that we overeat, the snack foods, the stuff that we really can't make in our own kitchen because there's so many different additives besides like, baking soda or something like that. And those additives helped that addictive nature that we've talked about in that addictive podcast. And so I think that there could be some sort of stoplight system around that instead of, let's say, listing out added sugars and saturated fat and doing it on this nutrient by nutrient analysis, we look at the food more holistically. So I can imagine, going back to your analogy, that maybe the whole ice cream aisle has the red light instead of somebody standing in the ice cream aisle thinking that they're going to pick up the low sugar ice cream and that's really going to move the needle. So it would be more broadly classifying, these are the types of foods that you want to minimize, and then these are the types of food that you want to maximize. Of course, we know that no system is going to be perfect. It still doesn't give that whole context. But I really like taking that step back instead of saying, okay, we're not just going to look at sodium and we're not just going to look at added sugars. What do these foods look like when they show up in our whole diet? And I think kind of that ultra-processed food label and collectively categorizing does that better for people.
Here's my last silly idea. In the grocery store, however it's done, the 4 groups, the red light, green light,
right.
On your receipt, it breaks down everything you bought. So it says 37% of the food you bought is in the green light, 40 whatever percent is in the X, Y, and Z. That would be kind of interesting to give you that would give you an interesting snapshot as to the overall makeup, not of everything, because people go out to eat, whatever's in the pantry, but would give you a sense of, okay, I spent $100 and 60 of those dollars were on red light foods. No judgment, just letting you know that that's what you just spent, 60% of your food budget on. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think I've kicked around that idea with somebody, or maybe I've seen it before. I do think it's interesting. I think there's also the issue that in some cases, some of these processed foods are quite cheap relative to cherries, or something like that. So again, it's a tough thing. I think conceptually it's quite easy. We're just going to encourage people to eat more healthy foods. But all of these systems ultimately require black-white decision-making, and we know that's where things fall apart, right? So I don't think it's a bad idea. I think it's just another one of these things that could generally help people be more aware of what they're eating, for sure.
Yeah. Going down the line a little bit, other than my silly ideas, do you have any other thoughts on how we could or should maybe accomplish the things that these food labeling decisions are trying to solve for?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of hinted at this in the beginning. It's like the more I'm in new education, I'm like, okay, the more we need to do something besides education. I don't think you could put the whole thing in caution tape. I don't think, that's going to do it. I don't think more labels are going to do it. I think we really have to change the environment to make eating more whole foods the default decision. I think, as we've discussed before, making it really easy, because that's what we find when people do it on the individual level, right? It's their whole environment change, and it's not just the kitchen. Oftentimes it's their whole lifestyle. It could even be their whole friend group, as we talked about in the kind of weight loss the weight loss Ozempic podcast recently. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really a linchpin in this. I think we can do all the extra education we want and new lower sugar guidelines, but until it's easier for people to make the right decision, I don't think we're going to see broad scale change. And I was looking at some statistics about how often people eat per day. And for Americans, we eat the 3 meals a day on average, no surprise, at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then on average, we have 2 to 3 snacks a day. So on average, we're eating about 5 to 6 times a day. And just think about that in terms of our food environment. Whether or not you're at the gas station, your house, a restaurant, on average, we're just constantly exposed to this stuff. Inevitably, you're going to eat more of it, on average. And so I think that's where some regulations would be really interesting, of where physically this stuff could be sold. Yeah. How many aisles a grocery store can have of the red light district, if we're going to keep using that idea. Why does it always have to be at all of the checkouts? Does a electronic store need to be, selling various processed foods? What's interesting, again, is as much as I like that idea, it's still not the simplest problem to solve. I think it sounds great conceptually, but like some whole business models are set up on processed food. Like gas stations, you go to them for gas, but they keep the gas cost so low because they make the money when you go in to get the drink and the snack. Movie theaters, right? The movie cost is actually quite low. They make the money on the concessions that they sell. And so this is where, like, conceptually, I love my idea, but it's like, okay, and how then do we address whole industries that are sort of built around that? So I think there's some ramifications that I don't have the answer to and haven't really thought through. But yeah, I think the environment has to be there with education. We can't just keep telling people to eat more healthy foods. Plenty of people have been doing that for decades and decades and decades, and we're still right here. Yeah,
I agree with that. I'm thinking about professional sports too, like going to a baseball game, basketball game.
Yeah.
The ticket prices would have to be 3 or 4x what they are if they're not making money on hot dogs and beer, right?
Totally.
Okay. Wonderful. I thought that was a fascinating conversation. And if folks are still listening, which I assume
anyone out there, do we have anybody
out there? You wanted to do, or you're going to do a follow-up email. Tell folks about that so that they can get on the list if they're not.
Yeah, head to optimizemenutrition.com/email to get on the email list for this episode. I just wanted to send out some of the sample labels that are being kicked around. I think it's kind of interesting to look at what some other countries have been trying, as well as what the U.S. I think is leaning towards, from best that I can tell. And I just think it's interesting to kind of see them visually, and you can decide how much they will help people make better decisions.
Amazing. Again, that's optimizemenutrition.com/email to get on that list. You'll send that out. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I will be back next week for a new episode of the, try that again. EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.